The air inside the intelligence tent was heavy with heat and humiliation. Outside, the wreckage of an empire floated silently across Tokyo Bay, the surrender ink barely dry. Inside, Major Hiroshi Takeda, once a proud staff officer of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service, sifted through boxes of captured American military records. He had seen reports on the P-51 Mustang, the B-29, and the endless convoys of aircraft that had darkened the Pacific sky. But something in this stack of flight logs made his hand pause. He read again, pilot, Mary Hafner. Aircraft, B-17F, Ferry Command, Texas to Kansas. Then another, pilot, Jacqueline Cochran. Type P-51 Mustang test flight. Confusion crossed his face. Mary? Jacqueline? Evelyn? The names continued. Dozens. Hundreds. All marked as pilots. Outside, an American officer passed by, nodding politely. Takeda stared down at the papers, his world shifting in quiet disbelief. He had fought a war believing his enemies were all men. Now, in surrender, he realized some of the pilots who ferried, tested, and perfected the machines that destroyed his homeland were women. The question burned in his mind. How could this have been possible? Across the Pacific, the rising sun seemed unstoppable. Within weeks after Pearl Harbor, Japan had captured Hong Kong, Wake Island, and Manila. Its Zero fighters roamed the skies with near impunity, outmaneuvering American aircraft and terrorizing the seas. In the Pacific, the U.S. Army Air Forces were still scrambling for survival. The American mainland, once distant from war, now felt the tremor of global conflict. Factories in California and Michigan ran day and night. Aluminum replaced steel, women replaced men. But in the air, in the cockpit, there was a problem no factory could solve. There were not enough pilots. By spring 1942, more than half of America's trained military aviators were already deployed overseas. Thousands of new aircraft rolled off assembly lines, but many sat grounded, waiting for pilots to ferry them from plant to base, from base to port. Training schools needed instructors, test fields needed flyers, and supply chains choked without enough hands on the yokes. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, saw the danger clearly. Air power was America's lifeline, yet its wings were tied by manpower. He faced an impossible equation: how to train, transport, and test a flood of aircraft without diverting a single combat pilot from the front lines. The answer would come not from the War Department's high command, but from a group of determined women who refused to be spectators. Among them was Jacqueline Cochran, already a famous aviator before the war. In 1938, she had won the Bendix Trophy race, beating some of the best male pilots in the world. Now, she wrote to President Roosevelt with a bold proposal: train women to fly military aircraft inside the United States, freeing men for combat. At first, her suggestion was dismissed. Flying military planes, especially the heavy trainers and bombers, was considered beyond a woman's physical and mental capacity. The Army brass doubted they could handle the demands of long-distance ferrying or the dangers of test flights. But war has a way of dissolving tradition. By mid-1942, desperation outweighed skepticism. At the same time, another woman, Nancy Harkness Love, was quietly ferrying light aircraft for the Army Air Forces. Her efficiency and professionalism caught attention. Soon, she was tasked with forming a small, elite group of women pilots, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, WFS, to move aircraft from factories to military bases. In Texas, Cochran began training a separate group under the Women's Flying Training Detachment, WFDD, teaching civilian women to fly military aircraft with full discipline and precision. The two programs worked independently, but with the same mission: to give America wings it didn't have. By the end of 1942, more than 100 women in olive drab flight suits were climbing into cockpits once reserved for men, steermen at 6 Texans, and even the twin-engine B-25 Mitchells. Their orders were simple but vital: fly the aircraft where it needed to go, no matter the distance, no matter the weather. They flew without weapons, without escort, and without recognition. Many men on the flight lines laughed when the first women arrived. Some refused to believe they were pilots at all. But the laughter faded as the numbers grew. Each ferry flight freed a combat pilot to join the fight overseas. Each successful delivery kept the assembly lines moving and the training schools supplied. Slowly, the experiment began to prove itself indispensable. By the time Japanese bombers hit Darwin and American forces began to push back in the Coral Sea, these quiet aviators had already moved hundreds of aircraft across the country. Behind the scenes, the foundation of American air power was being laid. Not in battle, but in the long, lonely flights between airfields stretching from Michigan to Arizona. The world didn't know it yet, but this was the birth of a new chapter in warfare, one where the boundaries between gender and duty blurred beneath the roar of propellers. The idea that women could fly warplanes, even if unarmed, was already rewriting the limits of what a nation could do when faced with annihilation. And as the Pacific burned, the Army Air Forces would soon realize that what began as an experiment was becoming a necessity. By early 1943, America's war industry had transformed into something no nation had ever witnessed. From California to Connecticut, the horizon glowed with the lights of aircraft. Factories, Douglas, Lockheed, Boeing, North American, each producing wings faster than they could be delivered. The skies over the United States became the arteries of a war machine feeding two oceans. But still, the bottleneck persisted. Combat pilots were desperately needed overseas, and yet thousands of aircraft crowded assembly lots. The answer was no longer a question of courage. It was organization. In August 1943, under General Arnold's directive, the two existing programs, Cochrane's Women's Flying Training Detachment, WFDD, and Nancy Love's Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, WFS, were merged into one, the Women Air Force Service Pilots, or WASP. For the first time in U.S. history, female pilots were officially serving as part of the Army Air Forces, though not as military personnel. They were civil service employees under military command. Their mission was simple in wording but immense in scale: to ferry, test, and train aircraft across the continental United States, ensuring the steady flow of warplanes to every theater of combat. At Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, the heart of the WASP program, rows of young women in khaki uniforms lined up under the scorching sun. They came from every corner of America, farm towns, city schools, flight clubs, and they carried with them an iron determination. The training was unforgiving. Out of more than 25,000 applicants, barely 1,800 were accepted. Of those, 1,074 would graduate. They flew everything the military had, from light observation planes to fighters and heavy bombers. The cockpit did not discriminate. Instructors treated them as equals to men. Long days began before sunrise with drills, weather analysis, mechanical checks, and then hours in the air. They practiced formation flying, instrument navigation, night approaches, and dead stick landings. The risks were real. 38 women would die during training and active duty. Their bodies sent home without military honors, their deaths unrecorded in official rolls. Still, they flew. By late 1943, WASPs were ferrying every kind of aircraft the United States built: the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-51 Mustang, the C-47 Skitran, and even the massive B-17 Flying Fortress. Some served as test pilots for new or repaired aircraft. Others towed targets for gunnery practice, fly with live ammunition buzzing around their wings. Their efficiency was astonishing. Over 60 million air miles were logged by the end of 1944. Aircraft that might have waited weeks for delivery were now in combat within days. Every successful ferry flight meant one more plane for Europe or the Pacific. And all the while, Japan, 6,000 miles away, had no idea. To the Japanese military command, the idea of women piloting military aircraft was beyond belief. In Imperial Japan, aviation was sacred, a domain of elite male warriors, bound by code and discipline. The notion that women could handle combat aircraft, even in logistical roles, was dismissed as Western propaganda. But America was fighting a different kind of war, not only with machines and men, but with mobility, industrial scale, and social adaptation. The WASP program embodied that change. It represented a society willing to break its own conventions to survive. While Japan's industrial base strained under blockade and bombing, the U.S. could afford to experiment, adapt, and multiply its efficiency by calling upon every capable hand. The result was not only more aircraft, but a new kind of strategic depth, one that Japan's rigid hierarchy could neither predict nor counter. By the summer of 1944, thousands of aircraft had been moved, tested, and prepared for war by these unseen aviators. In hangars and depots across the country, male pilots heading to Pacific often climbed into planes last flown by women, checked, ferried, and signed off for combat. Every Mustang that roared off a carrier deck, every B-29 that set course to the Japanese mainland, owed its readiness to hands the enemy never imagined existed. What began as an emergency measure was now a critical artery of America's war engine. And as the tide began to turn at sea and in the air, the silent work of the Wasp became the invisible backbone of victory, even as they remained unknown to the very men they were helping to save. By 1943, the American arsenal of flight was evolving faster than any air force in history. The P-47 Thunderbolt, P-51 Mustang, and B-24 Liberator represented the cutting edge of aeronautical engineering, machines that demanded precision, strength, and nerve. Many believed these aircraft were too powerful for civilian hands. The Wasps proved otherwise. At bases like Love Field in Texas and Romulus in Michigan, women pilots stepped into aircraft fresh from the assembly line, untested, sometimes unfinished, and ferried them thousands of miles to coastal bases. They flew without radio beacons, without escort, navigating by map, compass, and instinct. When engines faltered or weather turned hostile, they faced the same dangers as combat pilots. The difference was that their enemy was a machine itself. Each takeoff was a test flight. Each landing, a small act of engineering trust. These women weren't passengers of technology. They were pioneers shaping its reliability. Mechanical reports from WASP flights often led to crucial design adjustments before the planes reached combat zones. The way a control stick felt, the vibration of a new engine mount, the stress of long-range fuel tanks, all noted by women aviators whose technical observations saved untold lives overseas. To the Japanese command, the American advantage seemed industrial. More planes, more pilots, more fuel. But the truth ran deeper. America's strength lay in its adaptability. Its machines didn't just multiply. They improved constantly, refined to the discipline and courage of pilots few enemy analysts even knew existed. Every war depends on training, and in World War II, training meant aircraft, thousands of them. By 1943, America's flight schools needed a constant stream of planes for cadets. Yet every combat-ready male pilot was already overseas. The Wasps became the bridge between the factory and the classroom. They ferried aircraft to training bases scattered across the Midwest and South, ensuring that no class of cadets ever lacked machines to fly. Instructors who once waited weeks for deliveries could now keep their students in the air without pause. In some locations, WASPs even became flight instructors themselves, teaching men who would later fight in Europe or the Pacific. Their presence was pragmatic, not symbolic. They taught navigation, takeoff procedures, emergency landings, and advanced flight techniques. The students soon realized that skill, not gender, ruled the cockpit. This quiet exchange transformed the U.S. Army Air Force's efficiency. In 1942, a shortage of training aircraft delayed graduation cycles by months. By 1944, thanks to WASP ferrying, the turnover of trained combat pilots doubled. To the Japanese, air combat was a sacred, elite craft. Pilots trained as warriors from youth, bound by spirit and sacrifice. In America, fly became a system, not a ceremony. It was methodical, industrial, and, crucially, scalable. The WASPs were part of that system, ensuring the rhythm of war training never broke. Every bomber crew trained on schedule. Every fighter pilot reached the front faster. Their service didn't just move planes, it moved time itself, shrinking the gap between production and deployment. There was another war, the one fought within barracks, hangars, and the human heart. When the first groups of WASPs arrived at military airfields, many male officers resisted the idea. Some refused to brief them. Others doubted their capability to manage large aircraft. The women answered in the only language the military respected: flawless performance. They endured isolation, ridicule, and a constant reminder that they were temporary. Yet they carried themselves with quiet resolve, their professionalism forcing a gradual shift in perception. To the mechanics, tower operators, and commanders who worked alongside them, the sight of a woman landing a B-26 Marauder or towing a gunnery target under live fire began to symbolize something larger than the mission itself. It embodied the idea that competence, not convention, sustains a nation at war. Back home, newspapers rarely mentioned them. Their operations were classified, their photographs seldom published. They didn't fly for fame or politics. They flew because the war demanded it. And while the Japanese military celebrated its kamikaze pilots with ceremony and ritual, these women remained anonymous, ferrying planes from dawn to dusk without medals or fanfare. Their quiet defiance, the refusal to accept limits in a world that insisted upon them, became one of America's invisible psychological weapons. Each mile flown under those conditions represented more than logistics. It was an act of conviction that the nation's survival justified any transformation, even the redefinition of what it meant to serve. For most of the war, Japan's intelligence divisions gathered vast amounts of data on American aircraft production, flight training, and industrial expansion. They estimated factory output, tracked serial numbers, even analyzed fuel consumption. Yet, amid the flood of intelligence reports, one detail never appeared: that women were flying American military aircraft. It was not entirely their fault. The WASP program was deliberately obscured within military paperwork. Records listed ferry pilots or civilian contractors, rarely specifying gender. Even aerial photographs of American training fields failed to betray the truth. For the Imperial Japanese Air Service, steeped in a warrior code that revered male sacrifice, the very concept was unthinkable. Women, in their cultural doctrine, symbolized purity and home, not the machinery of war. To imagine them piloting bombers or fighters, even unarmed, would have clashed violently with their worldview. When Japanese officers later examined captured American flight rosters after the war, disbelief turned to disorientation. How could a nation so young in spirit, so undisciplined in their eyes, entrust women with the lifeblood of its air fleet? The revelation struck at the heart of Japan's strategic misjudgment. They had measured America's strength by weapons and numbers, but not by flexibility. While Japan's war machine remained bound to hierarchy and tradition, the United States had turned necessity into innovation, the idea that a society could bend its own social rules to survive. Even letting women ferry its warplanes was beyond Japan's comprehension until it was too late. In that realization lay a quiet form of defeat. Cultural as much as military, behind every successful military innovation lies a leader willing to defy convention. For the WASP program, that leader was General Henry Hap Arnold, the architect of American air power. Arnold understood the risk of public backlash. America in 1943 was still conservative in its expectations of gender roles, and integrating women into the military air structure was politically explosive. He approved the creation of the WASP, but insisted on secrecy. The women would wear uniforms but hold civilian status. Their service would be functional, not ceremonial. This decision protected the program from political interference, but also erased its recognition. When a WASP died, the flag on her coffin came not from the War Department but from her family's hands. When her plane crashed, her name appeared in no official military roll. Yet Arnold saw the larger picture. Every WASP flight meant one more combat pilot available for the front lines. Every hour saved in ferrying meant another plane fighting sooner in the Pacific or Europe. In his view, this silent contribution outweighed any argument about visibility or honor. By late 1944, however, pressure grew to disband the program. Male pilots returning from combat demanded jobs, and the notion of women continuing to fly military aircraft during peacetime was politically untenable. Arnold fought for them, testifying to Congress that the women had proved beyond question that they can fly military aircraft, handle them efficiently, and deliver them wherever they are needed. His words came too late. In December 1944, the WASP was officially deactivated. No parade marked its end. The records were sealed. For decades, few outside the Air Forces even knew it had existed. But Arnold's gamble had already paid off. The skies over the Pacific were filled not just with planes, but with the unseen labor of those who had made their flight possible. When the war ended, The Wasps returned home quietly, stripped of military status, denied veteran benefits, and largely forgotten. Their uniforms went into trunks. Their achievements disappeared into archives. For years, they lived as teachers, mothers, and engineers, their wartime past spoken of only in fragments. But their legacy endured in a subtler form, a shift in perception. Within military and industrial circles, the idea that women could handle the discipline and danger of advanced machinery was no longer theoretical. The Wasps had proven it in practice, across millions of miles and thousands of aircraft. Japan's post-war analysts noted this transformation with fascination and discomfort. Their internal reports in 1946 and 1947 describe America's wartime mobilization as total, a fusion of civilian and military effort that blurred all traditional boundaries. The mention of female aviators, once dismissed as rumor, now appears evidence of America's unmatched adaptability. The moral irony was profound. The same women who had been denied official military status had, through their service, helped redefine what modern warfare demanded of a nation. Their courage had never been ideological. It was functional, disciplined, and rooted in necessity. They didn't fight for equality. They fought because there was a job to do, and no one else left to do it. For the Japanese officers reading those post-war reports, the realization carried a quiet humiliation. The empire that had once dismissed America as decadent had been defeated, in part, by a system that allowed its women to rise above the boundaries of tradition. In that understanding, Japan's defeat was complete, not only in the air but in the imagination of what a nation could become when survival was at stake. Spring 1944. The United States had become the largest air power in human history. Every 63 minutes, another aircraft rolled off an American assembly line. From the Pacific coast to the Great Plains, runways were jammed with the roar of engines. Fighters, bombers, transports, an unbroken chain of wings stretching from the heartland to the front. At the height of this momentum, the WASP program reached full strength. Over 1,000 women pilots were now operating at 120 bases nationwide. They were no longer a curiosity. They were the invisible bloodstream of the U.S. Army Air Forces. At Avenger Field, Jacqueline Cochran reviewed the latest reports. In just 12 months, WASPs had ferried more than 12,000 aircraft, flying nearly 60 million miles. They had tested new models, conducted dangerous flight checks, and delivered every class of plane, from the P-51 Mustang to the B-29 Superfortress. The logistics were staggering. Each aircraft built in America's factories had to be moved, often across thousands of miles, to coastal embarkation points or training centers. Civilian airlines were already stretched thin transporting troops and cargo. Without the WASPs, the system would have jammed completely. They flew alone, unarmed, across an America that was itself a battlefield of weather. Thunderstorms, blizzard, mechanical failures. Each could be fatal. There was no formation to hide in, no wingman for protection. When a WASP went down, it was often in silence, somewhere over endless farmland or desert. But their endurance turned into reliability, and reliability became power. Each aircraft they delivered represented another step toward the air offensives now gathering momentum across the Pacific, the coming storm over Japan. While the men in the Pacific fought the visible war, these women fought the invisible one, a war of logistics, endurance, and precision. Their work created the rhythm of replacement that allowed combat wings to stay in the fight. When AP-47 was lost over New Guinea, another arrived days later. When B-24 squadrons burned in the skies over Truk or Rabaul, replacements were already inbound from California, planes once ferried by WASPs across the continent. The Japanese High Command could not comprehend how the Americans never seemed to run out of planes. They bombed supply depots, sank freighters, and ambushed convoys, yet the U.S. air strength only grew. To them, it was a mystery of industrial sorcery. In truth, it was organization, and a human bridge of pilots who kept that organization alive. By mid-1944, the WASPs were testing aircraft so advanced they hadn't even reached combat yet. Some, like the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, the first operational American jet fighter, were still secret. These women flew prototypes and experimental machines with composure that stunned visiting officers. One test report noted simply, pilot conducted all procedures as standard, no deviation observed. Recommendation, aircraft cleared. The pilot was 24 years old. At certain bases, WASPs were assigned to tow aerial targets for live gunnery training. The risk was extraordinary. Ground crews and anti-aircraft trainees fired real ammunition at cloth targets trailing behind their planes. A single miscalculation meant instant death, yet they accepted the assignment without hesitation. To the public, the WASPs remained a footnote, their records classified, their missions unannounced. Even other military branches rarely knew they existed. But among those who worked with them, the mechanics, tower operators, flight controllers, respect had quietly replaced skepticism. The sight of a woman stepping out of a fighter cockpit no longer shocked anyone. It had become part of the fabric of daily war. In the Pacific, the impact of that quiet efficiency began to take shape. By late 1944, the Mariana Islands had fallen, and the massive B-29 superfortresses were within range of Tokyo. The aircraft that carried the war to Japan were not ferried by WASPs overseas. That duty belonged to male crews. But the planes themselves, every one of them, had once passed through WASP hands. Tested, cleared, and delivered by women who had mastered the art of flight in America's own skies. Each takeoff from Tinian or Saipan traced its lineage back to a hangar in Kansas, a test strip in Texas, a logbook signed in feminine handwriting. The distance between those worlds, between the dust of the training fields and the fire over Tokyo, was invisible, but it was real. It was the unspoken connection between those who built, tested, and trusted the machines of war. For the Japanese officers who would one day study this chain of logistics, the revelation would be shattering. The planes that darkened their skies were born not only of American steel and fuel, but of American adaptability, a kind their rigid doctrines could never match. And yet, even as victory drew closer, the WASP's own battle for recognition was nearing its breaking point. Tokyo Bay, September 2nd, 1945. The war that had consumed the world was finally over. The air was still, the waters calm, a silence that felt heavier than gunfire. From the deck of the USS Missouri, the representatives of a fallen empire bowed their heads and signed their names beneath those of their conquerors. But the war's paperwork did not end with the signatures. For weeks after, teams of American intelligence officers and Japanese translators combed through archives, warehouses, and shattered ministry buildings. They cataloged records, interrogated officers, and documented every fragment of Japan's wartime machinery. One of those translators was Major Hiroshi Takeda, once a liaison officer in the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service. He had survived the bombings of Tokyo, the collapse of his command, and the shame of surrender. Now he sat in a dim tent near Yokosuka, working through stacks of captured American documents that had been brought ashore by the occupying forces. Most of it was technical, aircraft specifications, fuel distribution charts, logistics chains. But then, among the endless files, he found something that did not fit the pattern. The header read, WASP, Women Air Force Service Pilots, Ferrying Division, Air Transport Command. He read the words twice, unsure if his English had failed him. Women pilots? The reports were meticulous. Flight records, maintenance notes, accident investigations. They contained names like Hafner, Cochrane, Love, Koch, Snap, hundreds of them. Each file bore flight routes across the continental United States, the types of aircraft ferried, and the hours logged. Takeda turned a page and saw the familiar silhouette of AB-29 Superfortress, drawn in technical precision. Below it, a line of type read, Final flight check by WASP pilot before transfer to 20th Air Force. He blinked in disbelief. The B-29, the machine that had burned his homeland and ended his world, had passed to the hands of a woman. He read further. Reports of test flights for the P-51 Mustang, the B-24 Liberator, even the experimental P-80 jet fighter. Each report bore the same unmistakable pattern. The pilots were women. His pen trembled as he jotted notes for translation. His mind could not reconcile the reality before him. In the Imperial Japanese Army, even the suggestion of a woman in uniform had been unthinkable. Women served only in auxiliary or medical roles. never as combatants, never as aviators. The idea that the enemy had trained women to handle war machines more powerful than anything Japan possessed, it shattered every notion of military order he had ever known. That night, Takeda brought the documents to his superior, a weary colonel who now served under American supervision. The older man adjusted his spectacles, scanned the reports, and frowned. "These are propaganda," he muttered. "No nation would do this." But Takeda shook his head. "No, sir, these are official records. There are hundreds of them. Names, serials, aircraft logs. It is all real." The colonel's silence stretched long and heavy. He finally exhaled, eyes distant. "Then that is why we lost," he whispered. "We built an army of pride. They built one of purpose." Days later, during a briefing with American officers, Takeda summoned the courage to ask, "These wasps, they were real?" An American general, gray and calm, still wearing the crease-fatigued uniform of wartime, nodded. "They were as real as any man who ever wore wings," he said quietly. "Without them, our planes wouldn't have reached the front. They were the bridge between our factories and our battles." Takeda looked down, struggling to find words. "You let women fly your warplanes?" The general smiled faintly. "We didn't let them," he replied. "They proved they could." The moment hung in silence. Then, in a gesture that Takeda would remember for the rest of his life, the general extended his hand. "War is over, Major," he said softly. "We all served our nations. That makes us brothers in the sky." Takeda hesitated, then took the hand. The touch was firm, honest, human, and in that instant, the walls that divided victor and defeated man and woman, soldier and civilian, seemed to dissolve. Later, as the sun set over the bay, he stood on the shoreline, watching the silhouettes of American planes roaring overhead. Not as symbols of fear, but as emblems of something larger, adaptability, courage, and unity. He thought of the women whose names he had read, names that would never appear in the history books of his homeland. Yet their work had changed the course of his life, and the fate of millions. He whispered into the wind, "We never knew, we never imagined." And as the sky burned with the color of the dying day, he understood Japan had not been defeated merely by bombs or industry. It had been defeated by imagination. 3 decades later, the sound of war was a distant echo. Tokyo had risen again, its skyline now filled not with smoke, but with glass towers and neon light. The world had changed, rebuilt itself from the ashes. Yet for Major Hiroshi Takeda, long retired, one image never faded. The moment he discovered the names of the women who had once filled the American skies, he had returned to civilian life quietly, teaching history at a small university outside Yokohama. His students were born after the war, their understanding shaped by peace, not destruction. One afternoon in 1977, a visiting professor from the United States, an aviation historian, gave a lecture on the women Air Force Service pilots. As the presentation began, Takeda recognized the same names he had once read on those faded papers: Cochrane, Love, Hafner, Snap. He listened as photographs filled the screen. Smiling women in flight suits, standing beside the machines he had once feared. When the lights came up, the room was silent. The historian concluded softly. They flew 60 million miles, trained 1,000 pilots, and delivered over 12,000 aircraft. And for 30 years, they were forgotten. Takeda raised his hand. His voice trembled slightly. "I saw their records once," he said. "After the war. I thought it was impossible." The American nodded. "Many did," he replied. "But they were real. They were pioneers." Afterward, as the audience dispersed, Takeda remained seated. For the first time in decades, the weight he had carried, the shame, the loss, the disbelief, felt lighter. He realized that history's true measure wasn't in conquest or surrender, but in those who dared to rise beyond the limits of their time. That night, he wrote in his journal, "We were defeated by those who refused to be bound by tradition. We believed war was the domain of men. They believed flight belonged to anyone with courage." In 1979, the U.S. Congress finally granted the WASPs military recognition, 36 years after their service. By then, many had passed away, but their legacy lived on in every woman who took to the skies afterward. And somewhere in Japan, an old man stood on his balcony, watching the contrail stretch across a peaceful sky. The same sky where once the fate of nations had been decided. He whispered quietly, with a tone of reverence. They flew and the world followed.